Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February last year, over 70,000 possible war crimes have been committed by the Russian armed forces. The sheer volume of the work facing prosecutors is so big, it could take them decades to bring the perpetrators to court. There are thousands of videos of alleged atrocities circulating on social media. One such film appeared in the first week of March. This is the video, widely seen on Twitter. The man in the picture, an unarmed Ukrainian soldier. It's a video of an execution. With the help of Ukrainian producer Olga Malcheska, we have been investigating that video and the open source material that goes around it to make sense of what happened. It took several weeks, which reveals to us just how time-consuming one of these investigations will be. And a warning, some of this report is distressing from the start. The battle for Bakhmut. It is the longest sustained Russian assault of the war. And in the fight for control of the town and the routes to it, both sides have suffered grievously. Neither will divulge any accurate figure of how many have been killed. But in the midst of this savage conflict, there are some horrific crimes being committed. One of which was captured on film. When we set out on this investigation some weeks ago, we'd still not confirmed the name of the man in this video. The confusion around his identity had stemmed from the initial statement issued by the Ukrainian military.
According to preliminary information, an armed soldier shot by Russian war criminals was Timofey Shadura from 30th Brigade. The final answer will be given by a relevant examination.
The name we were given was Timofey Shadura. This is him. He's from a village northwest of Kyiv, and you'll notice that he does in fact bear some resemblance to the dead soldier in our video. We know that Shadura had gone missing in the new year around the town of Zalitsnyanska. It's just 12 miles from Krasnohora, where the execution video was allegedly filmed. The army said the body was still lying behind enemy lines, but a journalist who'd spoken to the Ukrainian forces in that area questioned whether the dead man was in fact Timofey Shadura. The name now being circulated was Alexander Matsievsky. And from this picture, taken some time prior to his death, you'll see that this man has a cut and a plaster above the right eye, which matches what we see in the video. Now, we've since made contact with the man who was commanding Alexander's unit.
We were set up in the bushes, which meant it was difficult to keep eyes on each other, difficult to communicate with all the blast and shooting. In a calmer moment, the guys managed to get closer. And that's when they found the two bodies in a tiny trench. We knew they were ours, but we couldn't tell who they were. They had been stripped of their weapons.
Alexander Matsievsky was 42, from Nezhin, northeast of Kyiv. He was born in Moldova. He'd worked in Russia, was divorced with a son, and before the war had worked as an electrician. By March, when the video began to circulate, the family had in fact already been informed that Alexander was dead. A body had already been returned to them. From Nezhin, we know that he'd gone to the front, where he'd been missing in action since December. Solidar had become a key target for Russia. This is video that was filmed around that same time of Russian soldiers coming under heavy fire, trying to advance on the town. Now, the family had been given very little detail on how he'd been killed, but then came this video of the execution, which by now was attracting worldwide attention. It was seen by his mother, Paraskovia. Here's the one interview that she's given to German media.
Ой, это было вечером. Я открыла в Фейсбуке и смотрю, Саша, вот этот кадр самый ужасный, вот этот расстрел. И я смотрю и понимаю, как бы это мой сын. И я закричала: «Саша, Это был шок. Саша. Также подтвердил и Мишка. Это наш папа. У него была истерика. Это наш папа. Бабушка, это папа. Мама, это папа. Как он курит, как он стоит, как он... Это была страшная истерика, это был крик души, это плакал, сильно плакал. Просто плакал, рыдал в трубку.
Now remember that until this point, we thought and had reported that it was this man, Timofey Shadura. The world's media, including the BBC, had to issue a correction. From that moment, Alexander would become the image of the resistance. His face had been appearing all over social media and even in the artwork on the side of buildings. A week later, President Zelensky presented Alexander's mother with the Golden Star.
Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, which were Alexander's final words. So where was he killed? Why was he alone, seemingly isolated from his unit? And who were the Russians that killed him? Alexander had joined the fight in March 2022. His commander said he'd had less than 2 weeks training. He belonged to 163 Battalion, the 119 Brigade of the Territorial Defence Force. It's not a regular unit, they're volunteers, more like Dad's army. And there are these units that are all over Ukraine. In fact, the BBC filmed such a team in Kyiv last year. Usually, the line of command for these units is pretty vague. And putting it bluntly, these men and women are not normally at the front of the queue when it comes to the supply of weapons and ammunition.
We don't have walkie-talkies for each soldier. We have one per unit, because having one for every soldier would be too expensive. One walkie-talkie costs $1,000. I have machine guns in my unit from the 1930s. They are around 80 years old. And with machine guns on wheels, I'm expected to intercept the Shaheds, the Iranian-made drones. Since summer and until our trip to Bakhmut, my unit had shooting training. Maybe 3 times, 30 rounds each time.
So, who killed him? The inexperienced soldier with an old gun and limited ammunition. From our investigation, we have geolocated Alexander's last known position close to this farm track on the eastern outskirts of the town of Krasnohora. As the crow flies, it's around 2 miles from Soledar on the approach to Bakhmut. And you'll notice as we go closer in that there is this wooded area close to the farm track, which corresponds to the trees that we see behind Alexander in the video. In fact, we can be even more precise than that. We've uncovered the exact coordinates. Alexander died at this exact spot. But who was it that killed him? Without signals intelligence, which belongs to the army and the prosecutor, there's only so much we can do. But let's start with this map that was taken from the social media Telegram channel of the Wagner Group. They are the Russian private military contractors, mercenaries, who've played a significant role in the fighting in this part of Ukraine. Now, this map is dated from the 30th of December, the very day that Alexander was executed. And if we take it and put it over the top of the Google map, you will see that this advancing red is practically right on top of Alexander's position. Now, for much of December, the Russian advance on Soledar had stalled, but on the 27th, 3 days before Alexander's death, the Russians, spearheaded by the Wagner Group, began advancing from the south and from the east. It's a classic pincer movement. These pictures from shortly after show Ukrainian military fighting back. You can see the ferocity of the fighting. The same day he was killed, the official Telegram channel of the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed Russian forces in the town of Krasnohora, conducting their special military operation, have killed up to 50 Ukrainian military personnel. But there is a bitter divide between the Ministry of Defense and this man, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man who runs Wagner. He was not about to let the army take credit for this advance. And here he is in Bakhmut in February, congratulating his men who by that time had fought their way to the outskirts of the city. Around that same time, he was boasting on the social media messaging app Telegram that it was his men who had taken Krasnohora. In this post from Wagner's press office, they issue a statement which says, today, the assault units of the Wagner PMC took the settlement of Krasnaya Gora. That's Krasnohora. I want to emphasize, he goes on, that there is nobody else around Bakhmut, no other special units within around 50 kilometers. There are only fighters of the PMC Wagner who will take Bakhmut. And we have found within these very same channels of communication a series of photographs of his men inside the town. Now again, we've geolocated these photographs. This one was taken at the western exit of Krasnohora, and this one from within the town. This is outside the Artemovsky construction factory, puts them down here on the southwestern edge of the town. Now, many of these men who were fighting for Wagner at this time in eastern Ukraine were former Russian convicts who were offered pardons if they served and survived 6 months. In just the past week, some have returned to Russia, but many have not. There are Russian mothers and wives posting photographs on Telegram of loved ones who have simply disappeared. And in February, around the same time Alexander's body was returned to his family, there was film from Novosibirsk in Russia of scores of these unnamed coffins that had been returned from the same battle. Many were killed, and some were captured. Our colleague Olga Matchevska has spoken to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine about his investigation.
Russians are demolishing the evidence, and our task is to try to find out everything possible once again.
What tools do you have to identify those people who killed the unarmed soldier?
Of course, it will take time. But, you know, one of the sources we have are prisoners of war which are in our possession. We will try to concentrate our efforts also not only with open source intelligence, but other sources of intelligence information in order to find who committed this crime.
The video, which started our investigation, is of course a crucial piece of evidence. Alexander had clearly surrendered. We know he'd been stripped of his weapons. He was compliant, so much so that he was smoking a cigarette. The Geneva Convention states it is a war crime to kill a prisoner of war who has laid down his arms and surrendered. It states killing or wounding a combatant who had laid down his arms or having no longer means of defence has surrendered at discretion is a war crime.
It's intentional execution of the prisoner of war, so which violate all possible international humanitarian law obligations.
How many Russian war crimes have you documented so far?
We have documented over 72,000 incidents of war crimes.
How much resource does it take to document each war crime?
Some of them took months, and they are still committed on Ukrainian land and against Ukrainian people.
In this case, the challenge is not so much proving a war crime was committed, it's proving who was present and who was responsible in the chain of command. And that, as the prosecutor says, is time-consuming. For investigators, it means not just looking at the physical evidence, but pulling all open-source material, identifying people, verifying movements, documenting it, making sense of it. These are pictures of an investigation in Izium, in Kyiv, where 450 bodies, most of them civilians, were found in a mass grave in September, each with an individual story. And there are more than 70,000 other individual stories. Wagner's boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has been asked whether it was his men who killed Alexander. The earlier boastful statements about Wagner's movements seem at odds with the denials he is now posting on Telegram. He tries to suggest the video is a fake, and he questions whether there is any proof of his unit's involvement. If that can be proved, he says, then we will, of course, investigate it in detail. It will be of some comfort to Alexander's family that in this case a body was returned and that he was formally identified, and he has since been interred in his hometown of Nizhin. But let's not forget where our story started. Timofey Shadura. What of him? What of the other men in Alexander's unit who were killed that very same day? The families say they've heard nothing, and they continue to wait for news. So in many ways, this case is still far from closed. Well, with us tonight in the studio is our Ukrainian producer, Olga Marshevska, who's done so much work on this investigation. And from LA, we're honoured to have with us Judge Chile Eboasuji, who was formerly president of the International Criminal Court. Judge, it's very good to have you with us. Let me start with you, Olga, if I may, because I've watched over the last 3 weeks how much work you've put into this, and we'll come back to that in a second. But I know that Alexander was only one of the men on that front line on that particular day, and you want to talk about the other two men who you've now identified.
Well, first of all, you've done a lot of work as well, so thank you very much. And yes, I just wanted to mention the names of other people who were killed from his unit. Those were Oleksiy Kotlyar and Bogdan Kava. Those were two other people who were also apparently in the trench, but they were not identified straight away. But then their families got it confirmed that they were killed. And also there are two people who are still considered to be missing. And one of them is Valery Cherhovsky. And so his destiny is still unknown.
But we must presume they'd been subdued in some way. They were probably prisoners of war as well, and so it might not just be Alexander. We just don't know at this moment in time. I also want people to get a feel for how difficult it is for Ukrainian journalists to do this work, because this is your country. And I've watched in the newsroom as you've gone through these videos, some pretty awful videos that have been posted by Russian soldiers. How has that been for you?
Well, thank you for considering that. Obviously, there were lots of, and you saw that, lots of pictures and videos. I have been going through the long list of Russian Telegram channels of the alleged fighters there, from Wagner people, from Russian regular soldiers. I managed to find lots of numbers of the regular Russian forces around Donbass as well, but it was not. We decided not to put it into this investigation to focus, because we understood that Wagner's were, well, we've got the confirmation from at least 3 sources that the people who were in that exact area around Krasnogora were Wagner people. So, but you saw probably, I saw, if maybe you remember some pictures which were quite dramatic, and well, literally it was more meat than people. And of course it was very difficult to look at that, and difficult to focus at some point and think like, okay, I don't have to think about that. I have just to locate the picture and make sure that I verify the location and the circumstances it was taken in. But I genuinely hope that I would not see any familiar faces there. I didn't.
Familiar faces, people you knew.
Yeah.
You can no longer get access to Prigozhin's Telegram channel, which is interesting in light of the responsibility that many people, he says, he takes for what has happened. It's
quite interesting, though, that roughly that time when we finished the investigation, he closed his Telegram channel. So I was very lucky that I made all the necessary screenshots and we managed to do our job. But then literally a day after we finished, he closed his Telegram channel from the general access. So now to join it, you have to, he moved it to another kind of account. But now to join it, you have to literally show your number, which obviously is much more dangerous for the journalists. And especially in light of one of the Russian bloggers who've been killed in St. Petersburg.
Just very quickly before we bring in the judge, because we've lots that we want to ask him. I don't know about you, but we spent so much digging around in this story. We spent a lot of time, and we just looking at the open source material, which, as you say, can disappear. What does the prosecutor, what do the Ukrainians say about what they need in terms of resources, money, the help, surely, that they need to investigate 70,000 cases?
Well, the Prosecutor General also mentioned to me in the part of that interview that it took them half a year just to put one case where Putin was involved, right? So imagine just half a year. And also other human rights lawyers who are working together with the Ukrainian prosecution, they told me that it takes 100 hours just to fill the forms for one case, even when they know already all the details when they investigate it. So just imagine the amount of work. They need manpower, they need people who would be doing that with them as well. Obviously, it's a question of resources. And also, speaking about the resources, you saw that heartbreaking thought of the commander who said that they were literally sent to the front line.
Well, that's another part of the story, isn't
weapons,
it? The
right.
weapons that they have, the old weapons that they have, and barely enough training really to be at the front. But
so that's a question of how quickly actually it is possible to get that weapon to the front line, and do they
which
have
they've been
any
talking about
choice?
in Warsaw today. Crucially important. Crucially important. Let's bring in Judge Ebo Esuji and tap some of the expertise. I don't know, Judge, if you've seen the video, but maybe you could inform us what the law is for prisoners of war, an unarmed prisoner of war. What does the Geneva Convention say, and what's your view of this particular case?
It is, in fact, very as clear as anything can be in international law that you do not execute a prisoner of war, an unarmed prisoner of war, someone who might have been fighting but no longer able to fight because they're now out of it. So you don't execute them, you treat them humanely. So that is clearly a war crime, as the picture is an apparent war crime. It's a question then about identifying who particularly this person is, the controversy going on about that. But I'd like to say, though, that this is definitely a horrific story that's being told. But you don't even need to go to that extreme to see the war crimes that are being committed. I mean, there's something that's not talked about amongst experts and academics in this field, but it needs to be. And that is that in this war of aggression in Ukraine, every killing of someone, be it a Ukrainian soldier who is fighting back in exchange of gunfire, the killing of that soldier is actually a war crime, arguably. So is the destruction of all property. So you don't need it doesn't need to get to the level of killing unarmed soldiers or civilians. It's as simple as killing a Ukrainian soldier engaged in combat is a war crime. Why do I say that? I say it because there is something called unlawful combatants versus lawful combatants. Lawful combatant is somebody who is entitled to fight that war, fight that battle. Unlawful combatant is someone who is not entitled to fight that battle.
So what does that mean then, Judge? What does that mean then, Judge, for the man that runs this mercenary unit, Yevgeny Prigozhin? Is he ultimately responsible for this?
Indeed. It means that because a war of aggression is an unlawful war, it is criminal in international law. So that does not give you the right to fight a battle as a combatant because you're engaged in an unlawful battle. So that now makes the killing of somebody you're fighting, makes that a war crime.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be, an unarmed.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, because I am pressed for time. I've only a couple of minutes left. You've heard Olga say that it takes 100 hours to fill in the paperwork for one case. There's been a lot of debate about a special tribunal. You've presided at the ICC. Is that what is needed? What sort of resources do the Ukrainians need to be able to do this properly?
They need all the help they can get. Every mechanism of justice, investigative mechanism of justice, needs all the help they can get. Ukrainians need it. The International Criminal Court needs it as well. So it is intensive work to be done, even in peacetime. The police officers will tell you that it's not a walk in the park to investigate a murder, let alone when it's happening in the midst of an armed conflict. So it is definitely a difficult proposition. It is an expensive proposition. And yes, it is resource intensive. It is that difficult.
Judge Ebo Esuji, thank you very much for that. Olga, let me give you the last word. We've just got a minute left. The family of Alexander, does this give them some peace?
Well, it's difficult to speak about peace, when your loved one was killed and when his mother found out about how it was done from the social media, as you absolutely correctly mentioned in our report. But at least it gives them hope that the justice can be restored, at least in that part where it is possible to restore it.
And because it's such a celebrated case, you would imagine that the prosecutor stays with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
At least they hope so.
Olga, thank you very much, and thank you for all the work that you put into that.